Today, we're telling a story most people don't know. It's about how England was born, not the version you learned in school, kings and castles and Shakespeare, the real story. The one that happened in mud and blood and marriage beds across 2 centuries that changed everything. If you grew up in Britain or America, you probably think you know this history. The Romans left. The Saxons invaded. Eventually, England emerged. Simple. But it's not simple. Between the year 400 and 600 AD, something happened on this island that doesn't fit into clean categories. It wasn't conquest. It wasn't peaceful immigration. It wasn't genocide. It wasn't harmony. It was all of those things. At the same time, in different places, to different people. Right now, the world is divided over immigration. People are shouting at each other. Some say it destroys nations. Some say it builds them. Both sides are absolutely certain they're right. But here's the thing. History doesn't care about our certainty. History just shows us what happened. And when you look at what actually happened 1,500 years ago on this island, not through modern politics, not through fear or hope, but through the evidence buried in the ground, you see something both sides miss. You see our shared humanity, the cruelty and the kindness, the violence and the love, the betrayal and the trust. All of it happening at once. Because that's what people do. That's what we've always done. 2 peoples, the Britons who had been here for thousands of years, and the Saxons who came across the sea, collided on this island. And neither side was purely victim or purely villain. Both were just people, with trying to survive, trying to protect their families, trying to build something that would last. Some fought, some fled, some stayed and mixed, some showed mercy, some showed none. And from that collision and that messy, brutal, beautiful collision, something entirely new emerged. A new language, a new culture, a new people who would call themselves English. We're not telling this story to make a political point. We're telling it because it's true, because it happened, and because the evidence is undeniable. Scientists have pulled DNA from graves across England, bodies buried 1,500 years ago. They can tell us now who these people were, who their parents were, who they married, what their children became. And what that evidence shows is more complex than any argument about borders or identity, more human than any slogan. The Britons didn't disappear. The Saxons didn't just take over. What happened was transformation. Gradual in some places, violent in others, sometimes both at once. Families caught in the middle making impossible choices. Kings making catastrophic decisions. Neighbors becoming enemies. Strangers becoming family. This is the story of how that happened. So settle in. We're going back to a cold, crumbling island at the edge of the Roman world, to desperate kings and arriving ships, to wars and weddings, to the moment when British and Saxons stopped meaning anything and English began. We're going to walk through this world not as judges, but as witnesses. We're going to see the cruelty and the kindness, the violence and the mercy, the losses and the births. Because that's what actually happened, all of it. At the same time, this is how England was born. Let's begin. Britain, year 400 AD. The Roman colonial rule in Britain had just ended. The Roman legions are gone. After nearly 400 years of occupation, the Roman Empire, the empire that built the roads, the walls, the cities, just pulled out of Britain. The soldiers marched to the ships and sailed away, and the people left behind had to figure out what came next. These people, the Britons, were not the same people Rome had found when it arrived in 43 AD. 4 centuries of Roman rule had changed them, not replaced them, changed them. They still spoke Celtic languages, Brittonic, the ancestor of modern Welsh. But many also spoke Latin, especially in the cities and towns. They were Christian now, most of them. The old Celtic gods hadn't disappeared entirely, but Christianity had taken root in the 3rd century and spread. They remembered Roman law, Roman organization, Roman ways of doing things. But they were still Britons, Celtic at their core. And now, for the first time in 400 years, they were on their own. Let's be clear about what Britain looked like in 400 AD. The total population was about 3.6 million people. Of those, only about 240,000 lived in cities and towns. The capital, Londinium, modern London, had maybe 60,000 people. That means most Britons, the vast majority, were rural, farmers, living in small villages and hamlets scattered across the countryside, working land that their families had worked for generations. Many still lived in Iron Age-style roundhouses of timber and thatch. They spoke Celtic dialects. They used pre-Roman farming techniques that worked just fine. Now, these people were Roman citizens. Technically, everyone in the empire had been granted citizenship back in 212 AD. But their daily lives hadn't changed that much. They paid taxes to Rome. They traded at Roman markets when they could. But most of them had never seen a legion, never met a senator, never set foot in Londinium. Rome, to them, was mostly roads and taxes. But in the cities, that was different. Londinium was ethnically diverse. People from all over the Roman Empire lived there. Natives of Britannia, yes, but also immigrants from continental Europe, the Middle East, North Africa. 5 major Roman municipalities had special charters and constitutions: Colchester, Lincoln, York, Gloucester, and St. Albans. These were real urban centers with stone buildings, public baths, forums, amphitheaters. The elites in these cities, the landowners, the merchants, the town council members, they lived Roman lives. Stone villas with heated floors, Latin inscriptions on their tombstones, imported wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain. They wore togas. They attended Christian services in stone churches that had once been pagan temples. Christianity and the older Romano-Celtic religion had mixed over the centuries. Indigenous Celtic deities and Roman gods were sometimes syncretized: Apollo, Cunomaglis, Sulis Minerva. New Romano-Celtic temples had been built that blended Iron Age and Roman architectural styles. The Britons weren't a monolith. They were a patchwork. Urban elites who spoke Latin and read classical literature. Rural farmers who spoke Brittonic and barely noticed when Rome left. Christians in the cities. Pagans in the countryside. Wealthy villa owners, landless peasants, all of them were Britons. All of them were trying to survive what came next, and what came next was chaos. Without Rome, the political structure collapsed almost immediately. The central administration was gone. The tax system broke down. The coin supply dried up. Local strongmen, former Roman officials, retired military officers, tribal leaders, started carving out their own territories. Gildas, a British monk writing in the 6th century, described a Britain divided among competing warlords with no central authority. One name surfaces repeatedly in the sources: Vortigern. He may have been a high king, though what that meant in practice is unclear. More likely, he was just the strongest of many competing leaders. To the north, in the Picts, the unconquered peoples beyond Hadrian's Wall, raided constantly. To the west, Irish raiders hit the coasts. The Saxon shore forts, built by Rome to defend against Germanic pirates, were undermanned or abandoned. The Britons were under pressure, real pressure, and they didn't have the manpower to hold it all together. So they did what desperate people do. They looked for help. Now here's what's important to understand. The Britons were not weak. They had survived as a people under Roman occupation for 400 years. They had absorbed Roman culture without losing their language or their identity. After the first wave of Saxon raids, British leaders like Ambrosius Aurelianus organized counteroffensives and won battles. They weren't passive victims waiting to be replaced. They were people trying to hold on to what they had, trying to protect their families, trying to keep some version of the civilization they'd known from collapsing entirely. And when they hired Saxon mercenaries to help defend the island, which is what happened next, they thought they were being smart, pragmatic. The Saxons were good fighters. Rome had used Germanic mercenaries for centuries. The Britons had fought alongside Saxons before. It seemed manageable. It wasn't. But before we get to that, before we talk about the ships and the soldiers and the invitation that changed everything, you need to see the Britons for who they really were. Not cartoon victims, not noble savages living in some pre-civilized paradise, not helpless provincials who collapsed the moment Rome left. They were people. Complex, divided, resourceful, with desperate people living in a world that was unraveling faster than they could adapt. Some of them would fight the Saxons to the death and flee to Wales to preserve their identity. Some would stay and adapt, marrying Saxons, learning their language, becoming something new. Some would die in the wars that followed. Some would survive and thrive. All of them were caught in something bigger than any individual could control, a collision of peoples that would remake this island entirely. Next, we're going to talk about the invitation, the decision that set all of this in motion, the moment when Vortigern, desperate under siege, running out of options, sent word across the North Sea. "We need soldiers. Come help us." They came. Around the year 443 AD, the Britons did something they had never had to do before. They sent a letter to Rome, begging for help. The letter, recorded by the monk Gildas, who wrote about these events a century later, was addressed to Aetius, the Roman military commander in Gaul. It's remembered now as the groans of the Britons. The message was desperate. The barbarians push us to the sea. The sea pushes us back to the barbarians. Between the two, we face death by sword or death by drowning. Rome's response was silence. Aetius was busy. He was fighting Attila the Hun. The Western Roman Empire was collapsing. Britannia, this cold, remote island at the edge of the world, wasn't a priority anymore. The legions that had protected Britain for 400 years weren't coming back, ever. The Britons were alone. The threats were real and constant. From the north, beyond Hadrian's Wall, the Picts raided relentlessly. They weren't trying to conquer. They were raiding for livestock, slaves, anything they could carry. Fast strikes. Then back across the wall before anyone could organize a response. From the west, Irish raiders, called Scoti in the Latin sources, hit the coasts of Wales and western England. Same tactics. Hit, take, leave. And from across the North Sea, Saxon pirates had been raiding the eastern coasts for decades. The Romans had built a whole chain of forts, the Saxon shore forts, to defend against them. But those forts were undermanned now, or abandoned. The Britons couldn't defend against all of this at once. They didn't have a professional army anymore. Rome had forbidden them from bearing arms for centuries. The warrior class that might have existed before Rome arrived had been Romanized into landowners and town councilors. They knew law. They knew trade. They didn't know the war. They needed soldiers. Fast. Enter Vortigern. Vortigern wasn't his real name. It's a title from the Celtic Vortigernos, meaning supreme king or great chief. We don't know his actual name. We don't know exactly where his power base was. But by the 440s, he was one of the most powerful warlords in Britain. Maybe the most powerful. And he had a plan. Germanic mercenaries had been used by Rome for centuries. They were good fighters, disciplined, effective, and they were available. Across the North Sea, in what is now Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, there were entire tribes of warriors looking for land and pay. The plan was simple: hire them to fight the Picts, pay them with land. When the job is done, they go home. It seemed manageable. Now, around 449 AD, the exact date recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Vortigern sent word across the North Sea. The message reached to two Saxon brothers, Hengist and Horsa. Now, modern scholars think Hengist and Horsa might be mythical. Their names literally mean stallion and horse in Old English. The alliterative animal names, the constructed genealogy tracing back to Woden. It all smells like legend, not history. But here's what we do know. Someone came. Maybe it wasn't literally two brothers named Hengest and Horsa, but Saxon warriors, real ones, responded to Vortigern's invitation. 3 ships arrived at a place called Ebbsfleet on the Isle of Thanet in Kent. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says there were maybe a few hundred men, warriors, professional fighters, and according to the sources, they brought families, women, children. That detail matters. Mercenaries don't usually bring their wives and children. At first, everything went according to plan. The Saxons fought the Picts, and they won, decisively. Wherever the Saxons showed up, the Picts retreated. Vortigern was thrilled. This was working. He rewarded the Saxons with land in Kent on the eastern coast, a small grant. Payment for services rendered, the Saxons settled in, built homes, farmed the land. And then, according to the sources, Hengist sent a message home. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it explicitly. They described the worthlessness of the Britons and the richness of the land. That message changed everything. More ships came, then more. Not just a few hundred warriors now, thousands. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, different tribes, but all Germanic-speaking peoples from the same region. Some came as mercenaries looking for pay. Others came as families looking for land. They kept coming, year after year, decade after decade. Bede, writing in the 8th century, describes the migration this way. So many people left their homelands in Germany that some of the regions they departed from were left empty. That's not a raiding party. That's a migration. Vortigern must have realized at some point that he'd lost control. The Saxons weren't guests anymore. They weren't temporary. They were settling permanently. And their numbers were growing faster than anyone had anticipated. The sources, written by Britons centuries later, so take them with caution, paint Vortigern as either a fool or a traitor. Negildus calls him a proud tyrant who was blinded and sealed the doom of Britain by inviting in wolves into the sheepfold. But was he a fool? Or was he a desperate man making the only choice that seemed viable at the time? Rome wasn't coming back. The Picts weren't going to stop raiding. The Irish weren't going to stop hitting the coasts. Vortigern didn't have an army. He didn't have trained soldiers. He had farmers and townspeople who hadn't held a weapon in generations. Hiring the Saxons wasn't stupid. It was the only option that made sense in the moment. The problem was what happened next. The Saxons weren't just fighting for Vortigern anymore. They were carving out their own territories, demanding more land, more payment. And when those demands weren't met, or couldn't be met, they took it anyway. The sources describe growing tension, arguments over payment, disputes over land boundaries. The Saxons complaining that the Britons weren't holding up their end of the bargain. And then, around 455 AD, open war broke out. Vortigern's son, Vortimer, led British forces against the Saxons. 4 battles were fought. The sources say the Britons won some. The Saxons won others. Horsa, one of the original brothers, was killed in battle at a place called Aylesford. So was Vortimer. The war was inconclusive. Neither side could win decisively. But the Saxons weren't leaving. They were here, and more kept coming. Now here's the part that shows up in legend, but might have a kernel of truth. After Vortimer's death, Vortigern supposedly tried to make peace. He invited the Saxon leaders to a feast to negotiate, a reconciliation, a treaty. The feast happened. Weapons were forbidden. Everyone sat down, British nobles next to Saxon warriors, and ate and drank. Then, at the height of the feast, Hengist supposedly shouted in Saxon, "Nime your Saxes! Get out your knives!" The Saxons pulled hidden daggers and slaughtered the British nobles, hundreds of them. Vortigern was spared, barely, and forced to grant the Saxons more land in exchange for his life. This event is called the Treachery of the Long Knives. Probably didn't happen exactly like that, but something happened. Some moment when the relationship between Britons and Saxons broke irreparably. And from that moment on, the Saxons weren't mercenaries. They weren't guests. They were conquerors. Or were they? Because here's where the story gets complicated. And the traditional narrative, the one written by British monks centuries later, paints this as invasion, betrayal. The Saxons as villains who tricked the Britons and stole their land. But the DNA evidence we have now tells a different story. Not a simpler one, a messier one. Some regions saw violent conquest. Others saw gradual integration. Some Saxon and British communities lived side by side, traded, intermarried. Others fought to the death. It wasn't one story. It was hundreds of stories happening at once across this island. What we do know is this. By the year 500 AD, just 50 years after the first 3 ships arrived, there were so many Saxons in eastern England that the language you heard in the markets, in the villages, in the fields was changing. Celtic was fading, Germanic was rising. The Britons who stayed had to make a choice. Adapt or leave. Fight or surrender. Hold on to their identity or become something new. Next, we're going to meet the people who made that crossing, the Saxon families who packed up everything, boarded those ships, and sailed to an island they'd never seen. They weren't all warriors. They weren't all conquerors. They were families, looking for land, looking for a future, just like the Britons they were about to collide with. Now, we need to meet the other side of this story, the Saxons, the Angles, the Jutes, the people who responded to Vortigern's invitation and crossed the North Sea. For a long time, historians imagined them as warriors, tough, battle-hardened men sailing in longboats, coming to raid and conquer, a wave of Germanic violence crashing onto British shores. That's not what happened. The DNA tells a different story, and it's more human than that. The people who crossed the North Sea weren't just men. They were families. The 2022 genetic study, the one that analyzed DNA from over 460 medieval individuals across northwestern Europe, found something critical. Both men and women migrated, in large numbers, from the very beginning. You don't bring your wife and children on a raiding expedition. You bring them when you're looking for a new home. These weren't warriors conquering territory and then sending for their families later. These were entire communities, farmers, craftsmen, their wives, their children, packing up everything they owned, boarding boats, and crossing 500 kilometers of open ocean to start over. Why? Because life where they were, in what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, was hard, and getting harder. The regions these people came from were coastal, marshy, flat. The land was difficult to farm. The sea was always threatening to take it back. And in the 5th century, things were getting worse. Rising sea levels, yes, this was happening 1,500 years ago, were flooding coastal settlements. Archaeological evidence shows that some regions the Saxons left were literally abandoned. Entire villages swallowed by the sea or rendered uninhabitable. At the same time, the collapse of the Roman Empire had shattered the old trade networks. The security and stability that Rome had provided, even to peoples outside its borders, was gone. Tribes were on the move, resources were scarce, violence was constant, and across the North Sea, there was Britain, an island people had been sailing to for centuries, an island with fertile land and forests full of timber, and, after Rome left, no army to speak of. Word traveled, stories spread, the message that Hengist supposedly sent home. The worthlessness of the Britons and the richness of the land may or may not have been written down like that, but something like that message reached people, and they responded. Crossing the North Sea wasn't as dramatic as crossing the Atlantic would be 1,000 years later. People had been sailing these routes for centuries. Trade between Britain and the continent was old. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes were coastal peoples. They knew the sea. They had boats, sturdy, open vessels capable of carrying not just people but livestock, tools, household goods. Still, it wasn't safe. Storms could capsize you. You could get lost in fog. The crossing took days, maybe a week depending on winds and weather. And you were bringing children. Imagine that decision. You're a Saxon farmer in your 30s, your village is flooding, food is scarce. You've heard stories about Britain, rich soil, timber, opportunities. A cousin went last year and sent word back. Come, there's land here. So you sell what you can't carry. You pack your family, your wife, your 2 young children, your elderly mother who insists on coming, into a boat with maybe 20 other families from your village. You leave the only home you've ever known. You sail. The first waves arrived in the 440s and 450s, small groups, a few hundred people here, a few hundred there. They settled on the eastern coasts, Kent, East Anglia, Essex, the flatlands near the North Sea, places that felt familiar. Vortigern gave them land, a payment for fighting the Picts. They built homes, not British roundhouses, but their own style, rectangular timber buildings with sunken floors called Grubenhäuser. They buried their dead in their own way, with their own pottery and jewelry styles. The British population saw them, traded with them. Some probably worked alongside them. At this stage, it was manageable. A few hundred foreign settlers in a population of millions. But then, more ships came, and more, and more. By the 460s and 470s, it wasn't a trickle anymore. It was a wave. Bede, writing centuries later, claimed that so many people left northern Germany and Denmark that some regions were emptied. That's probably an exaggeration. But archaeological evidence does show abandoned settlements in Saxony and England during this period. Entire communities were moving, not armies, to communities. And here's what makes this different from a conquest. They brought their culture with them, yes, but they didn't immediately wipe out British culture. They lived alongside it. At a cemetery in Oakington near modern Cambridge, archaeologists found burials spanning generations. Pure Britons, pure Saxons, and mixed ancestry individuals, people with one British parent and one Saxon parent, all buried in the same cemetery using similar customs. One grave, burial number 66, held a woman in her 20s with mixed ancestry. Her mother or father was British, the other was Saxon. She was buried with Saxon-style pottery, brooches, and a Roman spoon. Her grave goods show she was part of both worlds, and she was clearly valued in her community. At another site, Buckland, but near Dover, researchers reconstructed an actual family tree across 4 generations using DNA. They could see exactly when and how Britons and Saxons intermarried. The first generation, separate. The second generation, intermarriage begins. By the 3rd and 4th generations, the distinction doesn't exist anymore. They're just one community. Integration was happening, real integration. People were falling in love, having children together, building lives together, but not everywhere. At a site called Appledown in West Sussex, the story was different. People with British ancestry and people with Saxon ancestry were buried separately. Different parts of the cemetery, different customs, no intermarriage visible in the DNA. This wasn't one story. It was regional, local, dependent on 1,000 factors we can't fully see anymore. In some places, Britons and Saxons became neighbors, then friends, then family. In other places, they stayed enemies. In some villages, Saxon culture dominated. In others, British culture held on. But across eastern and southern England, one pattern was undeniable. Saxon numbers were growing. Fast. By the year 500, genetic studies suggest that 76% of the ancestry in eastern England came from continental Europe. That's not a small, elite, imposing culture. That's population replacement through sheer numbers. And those numbers brought something the Britons couldn't compete with, a new language. When the first Saxons arrived, they spoke Old English, a Germanic language closely related to Old Frisian and Old Saxon. It was completely unintelligible to Britons, who spoke Brittonic Celtic languages. But as Saxon numbers grew, Old English became the language of trade, of marriage negotiations, of getting ahead. If you wanted to sell your goods at a Saxon market, you learned their language. If your daughter married a Saxon farmer, her children grew up speaking Old English. Within 2 generations, bilingualism became common in mixed communities. Within 3 generations, Brittonic was fading. Not because it was banned, because it stopped being useful. Languages don't die from laws. They die from economics, from marriages, from children who grow up speaking one language at home and another language everywhere else. And eventually, the language they speak everywhere else wins. So who were the Saxons who crossed the North Sea? They were farmers looking for better land, young families hoping their children would have more opportunities than they did, craftsmen hearing about work in Britain, widows following their sons, old men who refused to die in a village that was sinking into the sea. They were people, as complex and flawed and hopeful as the Britons they were about to collide with. Some of them were violent, some were kind, some came looking for a fight, most came looking for a farm, and when they arrived and looked around at this island, green, forested, full of rivers and fertile soil, they saw what Hengist supposedly saw, a good place to live. The problem was, it was already someone else's home. Next, we're going to see what happened when these 2 worlds actually met. When Saxon farmers and British farmers became neighbors. When the novelty wore off and the tension started building. The first generation, the one that tried to make this work. So now we have 2 peoples on the same island. The Britons, speaking Celtic languages, Christian, Roman in memory if not always in practice, trying to hold on to what their ancestors built. And the Saxons, speaking a Germanic tongue, pagan, carrying their culture across the sea, building their own homes in a strange land. What happened when they actually met? Not in battle, not in some dramatic confrontation, just daily life, markets, fields, shared rivers, villages a few miles apart. What did the first generation look like? The answer is, it depends where you were. Because this wasn't one story. It was hundreds of local stories playing out differently across this island. And the archaeological evidence shows the full spectrum, from total separation to deep integration, with everything in between. Let's start with a place where things went relatively well. Oakington, Cambridgeshire. This was a cemetery used from the mid-5th to early 7th century. Archaeologists excavated it, pulled DNA from the bones, and reconstructed who was buried there. What they found? Pure Britons, pure Saxons, and people of mixed ancestry. One British parent, one Saxon parent, all buried in the same cemetery. That matters. Cemeteries weren't just holes in the ground, they were community spaces. Where you buried your dead said something about who you were and who you belonged to. At Oakington, Britons and Saxons were burying their dead together using similar customs with similar grave goods from the very beginning. Some graves held Saxon-style pottery and jewelry. Others held British styles. Many held a mix, Romano-British brooches alongside Germanic beads. And then there's burial number 66, a woman in her 20s. Mixed ancestry, one parent British, one Saxon. She was buried with grave goods that showed she was respected, valued, not shunned for being mixed, not treated as lesser. She was part of the community. Here's what that tells us. Integration was possible, real integration, not just tolerance, not surface-level coexistence. People were marrying across ethnic lines, having children together, raising those children in communities that accepted them. But it took time. The DNA evidence at Oakington shows that intermarriage wasn't immediate. The first generation, the Saxons who arrived and the Britons who were already there, mostly stayed separate. They buried their dead near each other, but not together. And the second generation, the children, that's when mixing started. A Saxon man married a British woman. A British farmer's daughter married a Saxon craftsman. By the third and fourth generations, the distinction was fading. People with mixed ancestry were everywhere. And their children? They probably didn't think of themselves as half British, half Saxon. They were just people, a new people. But Oakington isn't the whole story. Because at another site, Appledown in West Sussex, things looked completely different. At Appledown, people with British ancestry and people with Saxon ancestry were buried in the same cemetery, but not together. They were separated, different sections, different burial styles. No evidence of intermarriage visible in the DNA. This went on for generations. Why? We don't know. Maybe there was a local conflict that never healed. Maybe the British community at Appledown was more insular, more resistant. Maybe the Saxons there were more aggressive, more exclusionary. Or maybe it was just choice. Some communities integrated, some didn't, and both existed side by side on the same island. Now let's talk about what daily life actually looked like in these early mixed communities. Imagine you're a British farmer in eastern England around the year 470 AD. You've lived your whole life in the same village. Your family has farmed this land for generations. A few years ago, Saxon families moved into the area. Not far, maybe 2 miles away. You see them sometimes at the river when you're fishing. You've traded with them, your wool for their pottery. The pottery is different from what you're used to. Germanic style. But it works. Your daughter is 16 now, marriageable age. And there's a Saxon boy, the son of a farmer like you, who's shown interest. He's polite, hardworking. His family seems stable. Do you let her marry him? This is the choice families were making. Real families, in real villages. If you say yes, your grandchildren will speak Old English more than Brittonic. They'll be raised with Saxon customs alongside British ones. Your daughter will learn to cook Saxon food, dress in Saxon style. The line between British and Saxon will blur in your own family. If you say no, you're holding on to your identity, your language, your way of life. But you're also isolating yourself because the Saxon population is growing. And if your children don't integrate, they might not have opportunities. There's no right answer, just consequences either way. The DNA evidence shows that intermarriage happened on a large scale, particularly in eastern England, Kent, East Anglia, the Thames Valley. And here's a detail that shows how complex this was. The burial evidence showed that locals and immigrants were being buried together using the same new customs, and they were having mixed children. The same new customs. That phrase is critical, because integration wasn't British people adopting Saxon ways, or Saxons adopting British ways. It was both groups creating something new together, a hybrid culture. Anglo-Saxon, yes, but not purely Saxon. British elements survived in place names, in Christian practices, in farming techniques. Physical finds, including brooches unique to southern Britain known as quoits, show culture was not merely transplanted from the continent. From the start, a new Anglo-Saxon identities were forming. New identities, not Saxon, not British, something else. But let's not romanticize this. Integration was happening, yes. But so was displacement, so was violence, so was loss. A 7th century law code in Wessex distinguishes clearly between Saxons and Welsh, Britons, and gives the Saxons significantly higher legal status. 2 centuries after the first Saxons arrived, British people in some regions were still legally inferior. Lower compensation if someone killed them. Lower fines if someone stole from them. This wasn't equality. This was a tiered society where being Saxon gave you advantages and being British made you vulnerable. And in that kind of system, intermarriage becomes strategic. A British family marrying their daughter to a Saxon man isn't just about love or compatibility. It's about survival, about giving your grandchildren a better legal status, about climbing out of a category that's being systematically disadvantaged. Over time, many Britons adapted to Anglo-Saxon culture and language, particularly in the lowland areas of Britain. In some regions, such as Wessex and Mercia, there is evidence of coexistence and intermarriage. Adapted. That's a neutral word. But what does adaptation look like when you don't have a choice? Here's another piece of evidence that shows the complexity. Linguistic evidence from royal genealogies suggests Britons played a part in the foundation of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In Wessex, early kings Celtic, Cadwalla, and probably Colin bear British names. In Mercia, Penda, Pibba, and Creota have names derived from Old Welsh. Let that sink in. The kings, the people at the very top of Saxon society, had British names, or British ancestry. That's not conquest in the simple sense. That's mixing at every level. Elite intermarriage, political alliances through marriage, British nobles marrying into Saxon royal families, Saxon warlords taking British wives to legitimize their rule over British populations. Power wasn't just flowing one way. So what did the first generation actually look like? It looked like curiosity and suspicion existing side by side, like Saxon children and British children playing together near a river while their parents watched nervously. Like a British woman teaching a Saxon neighbor how to find wild herbs, like a Saxon blacksmith shoeing a British farmer's horse, and the farmer not quite trusting the work but needing it anyway. It looked like market days where 2 languages were spoken, slowly at first, then faster as people learned each other's words. Like Saxon traders realizing that British customers preferred certain pottery styles, so they started making those styles. Like British craftsmen copying Saxon metalwork techniques because they were better. It looked like a British grandfather watching his grandson, half Saxon by blood, play with a wooden sword and speaking a language the old man barely understood. And the grandfather thinking, is this still my family? Or is this something else now? The first generation had choices, hard ones. Fight the change, flee west to Wales or Cornwall where British culture was still dominant, or stay and adapt, learn the new language, marry into the new communities. You let your children become something you didn't quite recognize. Most people chose to stay because leaving meant abandoning land your family had worked for generations. It meant starting over somewhere unfamiliar. It meant admitting defeat. So they stayed, and they adapted. And in adapting, they changed both themselves and the Saxons they lived alongside. Next, we're going to talk about the moment when the numbers tipped, when the Saxon population in eastern England grew so large that the balance of power shifted, when being British stopped being the default and started being the minority. That's when the tension that had been simmering for decades finally broke. There's a moment in every migration story, every collision of peoples, when something shifts, not dramatically, not with a bang, but quietly, like a scale tipping. One day you look around and realize you're the minority now. For the Britons in eastern England, that moment came somewhere between 470 and 520 AD. Let's talk about numbers. When the first Saxon ships arrived in the 440s and 450s, the migrant population was small. Maybe 10,000 people across the entire island, maybe fewer. In a Britain that still had around 3 to 4 million inhabitants, most of them British, that was manageable. Visible, yes. Different, yes. But containable. But migration didn't stop. It accelerated. By the year 500 AD, just 50 years later, estimates suggest that between 100,000 and 200,000 Saxons, Angles, and Jutes had crossed the North Sea. And they kept coming. Ships arriving year after year, families, communities, entire villages packing up and moving. Bede, writing in the 8th century, claimed that the migration was so large that parts of northern Germany and Denmark were left depopulated. Modern archaeologists have found evidence supporting this. Abandoned settlements in Saxony and Anglo from exactly this period. The Saxon population wasn't just growing, it was exploding. And in eastern England, Kent, East Anglia, Essex, the lands around the Thames, the demographic balance was shifting fast. The 2022 DNA study gives us hard numbers for what this looked like. In eastern England, by the early 6th century, up to 76% of the genetic ancestry came from continental northern Europe. That's not cultural influence. That's not a small elite imposing language and customs. That's population replacement through sheer numbers. To be clear, this doesn't mean 76% of Britons were killed or driven out. What it means is that over 2 or 3 generations, the Saxon population grew so fast through continued migration and higher birth rates that British ancestry became the minority. The Britons who stayed weren't erased, but they were outnumbered. And in a world where numbers dictate power, that changed everything. Here's what happens when you become the minority in your own homeland. Your language stops being useful. If you're a British farmer and you want to sell grain at the market, but the market is now run by Saxons, you learn Old English. If your daughter wants to marry a man with land and prospects, and most of the men with land and prospects are Saxon, she marries a Saxon. And your grandchildren grow up speaking their father's language, not yours. Your customs fade. The way you bury your dead, the way you build your homes, the gods you worship. All of it starts to feel old, out of step. Your children see Saxon burial practices, furnished inhumations with jewelry and pottery, and they want that, because that's what success looks like now. Your identity becomes a liability, because in a world where Saxons hold power, being visibly British means being lower status. We know this because of a 7th century law code from Wessex, one of the Saxon kingdoms that emerged during this period. The law explicitly distinguishes between Saxons and Welsh, the Saxon word for Britons, and it sets different compensation rates. If someone kills a Saxon, the fine is higher. If someone kills a Briton, the fine is lower. That's what it looks like when you lose the demographic majority. Your life becomes worth less. Legally. But let's not imagine this as a clean, organized takeover. It wasn't. This was regional, chaotic, different in every village. In some places, Saxon numbers overwhelmed British populations so completely that British identity simply dissolved. The children of mixed marriages identified as Saxon because Saxon was the dominant culture. Within 2 generations, you couldn't tell who had British ancestors and who didn't. Everyone was just Saxon. In other places, particularly in the west and north, Britons held on. Wales, Cornwall, parts of what would become Scotland. The Saxons tried to push into these regions and were pushed back. The British kingdoms that survived, Gwynedd, Dumnonia, Strathclyde, remained defiantly British for centuries. Their language, their Christianity, their identity. And in a few places, something stranger happened. Integration that actually worked. Communities where Britons and Saxons mixed so thoroughly that a new identity emerged. Not purely British, not purely Saxon. Anglo-Saxon, a hybrid. One piece of evidence that shows how complicated this was: royal genealogies. The kings of Wessex, one of the most powerful Saxon kingdoms, include men with British names: Cerdic, Cedwalla, Selin. These aren't Germanic names. They're British, derived from Old Welsh. In Mercia, another major Saxon kingdom, early kings like Penda, Pibba, and Creota also bear British-derived names. What does that mean? It means that at the elite level, among the warlords and kings who were carving out these new kingdoms, intermarriage was happening. Saxon men were taking British wives to legitimize their rule over British populations. Or British nobles were allying with Saxon warlords and giving their daughters in marriage to seal those alliances. Power was mixing at the top and at the bottom. But that doesn't mean it was equal, because the trajectory was clear. Saxon culture was winning. Saxon language was winning. And British identity, in most of eastern and southern England, was fading. Here's the thing that makes this so brutal to understand. For most Britons living through this, there was no single moment when they lost. No battle where everything changed. No decree that forced them to stop being British. It was 1,000 small defeats. Your son learns Old English because he needs it for trade. Your daughter marries a Saxon because he has better land. Your grandchildren speak Saxon at home because that's what their mother speaks. The priest at the church, still Christian, still technically your religion, starts conducting services in Old English because most of the congregation doesn't understand Brittonic anymore. And one day, you wake up and realize your people are gone, not dead, not driven away, but transformed into something else. And there's nothing you could have done to stop it. Because it wasn't violence that erased British identity in Eastern England. It was demographics. It was economics. It was the slow, grinding logic of survival in a world where being Saxon opened doors and being British closed them. By the year 600 AD, 150 years after Vortigern invited those first 3 ships, the transformation was complete in most of the lowlands. The language spoken from Kent into East Anglia, from the Thames Valley to the Humber River, was Old English. Not Brittonic. Germanic place names replaced Celtic ones. Saxon kings ruled Saxon kingdoms. Christianity was fading in these regions. The Saxons were pagan, and the church that had survived under the Britons was collapsing without Roman support. To an outsider visiting Britain in 600 AD, walking through a village in Kent or Essex, they would see Saxon homes, hear Old English, watch pagan religious practices. If you told them that 150 years earlier, this land had been entirely British, Celtic-speaking, Christian, Roman in memory, they wouldn't believe you. The transformation was that complete, but not everywhere. In the West, in Wales, in Cornwall, the Britons who had fled or held their ground were still there, still speaking Brittonic languages, still Christian, and still holding on to their identity with a fierceness born from watching everything east of them disappear. And they remembered. They remembered that this island had been theirs, that their ancestors had survived Rome and thought they could survive anything, that they had made a decision, one decision, inviting the Saxons in, and it had cost them nearly everything. The refugees in Wales would preserve that memory for over 1,000 years. The language you can still hear in Wales today, Welsh, is the same language the Britons spoke in London, in York, in Canterbury before the Saxons came. It survived, not where it started, but it survived. Next, we're going to talk about what it actually felt like when the wars came. Because this transformation wasn't entirely peaceful. There were battles, there was violence. There were moments when Britons fought back with everything they had. And for a time, a brief, desperate time, they thought they might win. The integration wasn't universal. The mixing wasn't peaceful everywhere. Because while some communities were intermarrying and building new identities together, in other places, the violence was constant and brutal. The sources, written centuries later, so treat them carefully, describe decades of warfare between Britons and Saxons, back and forth, neither side winning decisively. Just endless conflict grinding down both peoples. Gildas, the British monk writing in the 6th century, describes it like this. From that time, the citizens were sometimes victorious, sometimes the enemy, in order that the Lord might try in this nation whether it loves him or not. Translation? It was chaos. Nobody was winning. God was testing them. Around 460 AD, just a decade or two after the first Saxon ships arrived, open warfare broke out. The immediate cause? The sources aren't clear. Maybe it was Vortigern's son, Vortimer, trying to push back against Saxon expansion. Maybe it was Saxon demands for more land that the Britons couldn't or wouldn't meet. Maybe it was just the inevitable result of too many people competing for too little space. What we do know is that battles were fought, real ones, with real casualties. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written centuries later by the Saxons themselves, records victories at places like Aylesford and Crayford in Kent. British sources record victories too. Nobody had a monopoly on winning. But the trend was clear. The Saxons were expanding, slowly, violently, taking ground. And then, around the year 500 AD, something happened that changed everything. A British war leader. We don't know his name for certain, but tradition calls him Ambrosius Aurelianus. Organized a resistance. Real, organized resistance. Not individual British kings fighting Saxon war bands in their own territories. A coordinated effort. Multiple British kingdoms coming together. Gildas describes Ambrosius as organizing a British resistance with the survivors of the initial Saxon onslaught. He was described as an able Roman who led the Britons in resistance against the invaders. The wars that followed weren't clean. They were brutal. Gildas says, from that time, the citizens were sometimes victorious, sometimes the enemy. Back and forth, for years. And then came Mount Badon. The Battle of Mount Badon, fought sometime between 490 and 520 AD, the sources disagree on the exact date, was the climax of this British resistance. The battle was credited as a major victory for the Britons, stopping the westward encroachment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for a period. Gildas called it almost the last, and certainly not the least slaughter of the Saxons. It brought the warfare to an end. The victory provided the Britons with at least 43 years of peace from the Saxons. We don't know where Mount Badon was. Bath is one candidate. Little Salisbury Hill near Bath is another. Liddington Castle, Badbury Rings. Historians argue endlessly about the location. We don't know who led the Britons. Tradition says King Arthur, yes, that Arthur, fought at Badon and won a crushing victory. But the earliest source, Gildas, doesn't mention Arthur at all. He mentions Ambrosius just before describing the battle. Later, Welsh tradition inserted Arthur into the story. By the 9th century, Arthur was being credited with 12 battles against the Saxons, with Badon as the climactic 12th. Did Arthur exist? Maybe. Maybe he was Ambrosius, under a different name. Maybe he was a separate war leader who came after Ambrosius. Maybe he's a legend built from fragments of multiple real people. We don't know. What we do know is this. The Saxons suffered a major defeat. Archaeological evidence shows Saxon expansion stopped. There are no Saxon burials in certain regions from the late 5th to late 6th centuries. Saxon ceramics disappear from areas they had controlled. The Britons won decisively. And for one generation, maybe two, the Saxon advance stopped. But it didn't last. Because here's the brutal truth. You can win battles and still lose the war. The Britons won at Baden. They pushed the Saxons back. They reclaimed territory. They had peace for decades, but the Saxon population kept growing. More ships kept coming. And the Britons? Their numbers were shrinking. Through war, through emigration to Wales and Cornwall, through intermarriage with Saxons that saw their children identify as Saxon, not British. By 550 AD, a new wave of Saxons descended on Britain and took almost complete control of the land. The peace that Baden had won crumbled. The British kingdoms that had united to win at Baden fractured again into infighting, and the Saxon advance resumed. This time, it didn't stop. By the year 600 AD, the transformation was complete in most of eastern and southern England. Saxon kingdoms had emerged: Kent, Essex, Sussex, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, Wessex, each ruled by Saxon kings, each speaking Old English, each pagan. The Britons who remained in these regions had a choice: identify as Saxon and integrate, or flee west to the British kingdoms that survived: Wales, Cornwall, the kingdom of Strathclyde and what is now Scotland. Thousands chose to flee. And in Wales, they kept their language, their Christianity, their identity alive for over 1,000 years. But thousands more stayed, and their grandchildren became English. Next, we're going to talk about those impossible choices: fight, flee, or adapt, and what each choice actually looked like for real families caught in the middle of a transformation they couldn't stop. So you're a British family in Eastern England around the year 520 AD. The wars have been raging for decades. Your grandfather fought the Saxons. Your father fought the Saxons. You fought the Saxons. You've heard about the great victory at Mount Baden. For a while, it felt like maybe, just maybe, the Britons would hold the line, push the Saxons back to the coast, reclaim the island. But now, looking around, you realize the Saxons aren't leaving. Their numbers keep growing. Their language is everywhere. Saxon warlords control more territory every year. And you have a choice to make: fight, flee, or adapt. There's no good option, just consequences. Choice 1. Fight. Some Britons chose to fight until the end. In the West, in Wales, in Cornwall, British kingdoms held the line. They organized armies, built fortifications, repelled Saxon invasions, and they survived. The Kingdom of Gwynedd in northwest Wales, Dumnonia in Cornwall and Devon, Strathclyde in what is now southern Scotland. These British kingdoms lasted for centuries, some until the 11th or 12th century. They kept their language, their Christianity, their identity, but it cost them. Constant warfare, constant vigilance, always on the edge, and they lost ground slowly. Devon fell to the Saxons by the 7th century. Cornwall held on, but was eventually absorbed by Wessex in the 9th century. Fighting worked, but it didn't win. Choice 2. Flee. Thousands of Britons chose to leave. The Great Migration west happened over decades, families packing up everything they owned, or what little they had left after years of war, and walking. To Wales, to Cornwall, to Brittany across the sea in what is now France. The refugees who reached Wales brought their language with them. Welsh today is the direct descendant of the Brittonic language spoken across all of Britain before the Saxons came. It survived because people chose to flee rather than stay and be absorbed. But fleeing meant loss. Leaving land your family had farmed for generations, leaving graves, leaving memories. And arriving in Wales as a refugee wasn't easy. You were starting over, in unfamiliar territory, with people who spoke the same language but had their own established communities and hierarchies. Some integrated successfully. Others lived on the margins for the rest of their lives. Choice 3. Adapt. And then there were the Britons who stayed in Saxon-controlled territory and adapted. This is the choice that's hardest to judge, because from 1,000 years away, it looks like surrender, like giving up your identity, like becoming the people who took your land. But for the families living through it, it looked like survival. Your Saxon neighbor isn't a faceless invader. He's the farmer you trade with, the craftsman who shoes your horses, the man whose daughter your son wants to marry. You learn Old English, not because you want to, because you have to trade, to survive, to give your children opportunities. Your daughter marries a Saxon man because the Saxon men have land, status, security. And you want your grandchildren to eat. Within 2 generations, your family has Saxon names, speaks Old English at home, buries their dead using Saxon customs. Are you British anymore? Your great-grandchildren won't think so. The DNA evidence shows that adaptation was the most common choice. In regions like Kent, Essex, East Anglia, where Saxon numbers were highest, intermarriage happened on a massive scale. Women of immigrant Saxon origin were buried with artifacts more often than women of local British origin, especially brooches and beads. But men with weapons had both genetic origins equally often. What does that tell us? That Saxon culture was dominant, that being Saxon gave you advantages, that even British men who fought were adopting Saxon identities, and at some sites like Buckland and Oakington, there was clear integration, but at others like Appledown, people with immigrant and local ancestry were buried separately. It wasn't one story. Some villages integrated, others stayed divided. But the trajectory was clear. Saxon culture was winning. Here's a detail that shows how brutal this choice was. A 7th century law code from Wessex, one of the Saxon kingdoms, distinguishes between Saxons and Welsh, the Saxon word for Britons, and it sets different compensation rates. If someone kills a Saxon, the fine is higher. If someone kills a Briton, the fine is lower. That's what it meant to stay British in Saxon territory. Your life was worth less, legally. So of course people adapted. Of course they gave their children Saxon names. Of course they learned the language and adopted the customs. Because the alternative was being permanently second class in your own homeland. But adaptation wasn't always complete assimilation. Linguistic evidence from royal genealogies suggests Britons played a part in the foundation of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In Wessex, early kings like Celtic, Cedwalla, and Sealan bore British names. In Mercia, Penda, Pibba, and Creota had names derived from Old Welsh. At the elite level, British and Saxon bloodlines were mixing, British nobles marrying into Saxon royal families, Saxon warlords taking British wives to legitimize their rule over British populations. Power wasn't just flowing one way, it was messy, complicated, human. So what did these choices actually look like? The fighter moves west to Wales, joins a British warband, spends his life defending the border. His children grow up speaking Welsh. His grandchildren know the stories of what was lost. They're British, proudly, but they're also exiles in their own island. The refugee leaves everything, walks to Cornwall, starts over, works land that isn't his for people who look at him as an outsider. His children integrate. His grandchildren are Cornish. The memory of where they came from fades. The adapter stays, learns Saxon, marries his daughter to a Saxon farmer. His son learns metalworking from a Saxon smith. His grandchildren have Saxon names and speak Old English and think of themselves as Saxon. The British part of their heritage becomes a vague family memory, then forgotten entirely. None of these choices were wrong. They were just survival. And together, they transformed Britain. Next, we're going to talk about the ones who stayed and mixed, the love stories, the families that bridged both worlds. Because integration, real integration, wasn't just political. It was personal. Now we get to the part that doesn't fit into clean political narratives. Love. Because while warlords were fighting and refugees were fleeing and kingdoms were rising and falling, ordinary people were doing what ordinary people always do. They were falling in love, across ethnic lines, across language barriers, across everything that was supposed to keep them apart. And those love stories, those marriages, those children, are what actually created England. The DNA evidence is unambiguous. At Buckland Cemetery near Dover, researchers reconstructed a family tree across 4 generations, showing exactly when migrants and locals intermarried. We can see the moment it happened. First generation, Britons and Saxons buried separately, distinct customs. Second generation, the first intermarriages, a Saxon man and a British woman. Or the reverse, third and fourth generations, mixed ancestry everywhere. The distinction fading, and one high-status woman with mixed ancestry was buried with silver jewelry, amber beads, and a whole cow. She wasn't shunned. She was wealthy, respected. Her mixed heritage didn't make her lesser. It made her part of something new. Imagine being that woman's parents, a British mother, a Saxon father, or the reverse. How did they meet? Was it a strategic marriage, her British family allying with a rising Saxon warlord? Was it genuine love, 2 people meeting at a market, overcoming language barriers, building a life together? The sources don't tell us, but the graves do. She was buried with prestige, with grave goods that show she had wealth and status, with an entire cow, a massive expenditure, a sign of respect and importance. Her community valued her, not despite her mixed heritage, because she represented what was emerging, a new people, Anglo-Saxon, not purely British, not purely Saxon, both. But let's not romanticize this. Intermarriage wasn't always about love. It was strategic, economic, political. Women of immigrant Saxon origin were buried with artifacts more often than women of local British origin. Saxon women had more wealth, more status, better grave goods. What does that tell you? That being Saxon was an advantage, that a British family marrying their son to a Saxon woman was a step up, that Saxon families had more resources, more power, more prestige. And the reverse? A Saxon man marrying a British woman? That happened too. But the children? They grew up Saxon. Because Saxon culture was dominant. The mixing happened. But it wasn't equal. Here's what intermarriage actually looked like on the ground. A Saxon farmer, 2nd or 3rd generation born in Britain, needs a wife. The Saxon women in his village are already spoken for. But there's a British family nearby. They have a daughter. Marriageable age, the families negotiate. The British family wants security, land. The Saxon farmer has land. He speaks enough Brittonic to communicate. He's respectful. They agree. The wedding happens. It's not a grand political alliance. It's 2 families trying to survive in a world that's changing too fast to predict. The couple has children. The children grow up bilingual. Brittonic from their mother, Old English from their father. But Old English is the language of the market, of trade, of getting ahead. By the time those children are adults, they speak more Old English than Brittonic. And their children? Fully Saxon. Yet the Brittonic side of their heritage becomes a family story. Your great-grandmother was British. Then, generations later, even that fades. The mixing created new identities, but it also erased old ones. Because when you're the child of a British mother and a Saxon father, what are you? If you grow up in a Saxon-dominated village speaking Old English, you're Saxon. Even if you know your mother's language, even if she tells you stories about the old days, identity isn't just blood, it's culture, language, community. And in a world where Saxon culture was winning, being half British wasn't enough to keep you British. At Oakington Cemetery, the richest burial was a woman of local British origin. That detail matters, because it shows that in some communities, being British wasn't automatically a disadvantage. This woman had wealth, status, prestige. She was buried with honor. Integration wasn't always about Saxons dominating and Britons adapting. In some places, it really was blending, both sides contributing, both sides valued. But those places were the exception, not the rule. By the year 600 AD, the mixing had created something new. The people living in what would become England weren't purely British or purely Saxon. Genetically, they were both. Modern English people derive about 38% of their ancestry from the Anglo-Saxons. The rest is British. But culturally, linguistically, they were Saxon. The language was Old English, the customs were Saxon, the kingdoms were Saxon. The mixing had happened, but Saxon culture had won. Next, we're going to talk about the ones who refused to mix. The refugees who fled to Wales and kept British identity alive for over 1,000 years. Because while England was being born in the East, in the West, something else was being preserved. While the mixing was happening in the East, in the West, something else was happening. Resistance, preservation, defiance. The Britons who fled to Wales, to Cornwall, to Strathclyde. They didn't just survive, they kept their identity alive, their language, their Christianity, their memory of what had been lost, and they passed it down. For over 1,000 years, Welsh is still spoken today by over 500,000 people. It's the direct descendant of the Brittonic language that was spoken across all of Britain before the Saxons came. That's what survival looks like. The refugees who reached Wales in the 5th and 6th centuries weren't welcomed with open arms everywhere. Wales had its own established British kingdoms, Gwynedd in the northwest, Powys in the east, Dyfed in the southwest. These kingdoms had survived Rome. They had their own hierarchies, their own leaders, their own ways of doing things. And now, waves of refugees were arriving. Families who had lost everything, farmers without land, former Roman townspeople who had never worked a field in their lives. Some integrated successfully. Others lived on the margins. But they all brought the same thing: memory. Memory of what Britain had been, of cities and roads and Latin inscriptions, of a time when Brittonic was spoken from Kent to Cornwall, from Sussex to Scotland. That memory became part of Welsh identity, a core part. The Welsh called themselves Cymri, fellow countrymen, the people who remained, the people who remembered, and they kept the language, not as a museum piece, as a living language, spoken, written, passed down. By the 6th century, Brittonic had evolved into Old Welsh. By the 12th century, it was Middle Welsh. By the 16th century, Modern Welsh. But it's the same language, unbroken, for 1,500 years. In England, Brittonic disappeared in most regions by 600 AD, replaced by Old English. In Wales, it survived, because the people who spoke it refused to let it die. The Welsh also preserved the memory of the wars, the stories of the Saxon invasions, the battles, the losses, the heroes who tried to stop it. This is where the legend of King Arthur comes from. Not from England, from Wales. Arthur, if he existed, was probably a Romano-British warlord who fought the Saxons and won at Mount Badon. He became a symbol, a memory of a time when the Britons fought back and won. The Welsh kept that story alive, embellished it, turned it into legend. But at its core, it's a memory of resistance. By the 12th century, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the history of the kings of Britain, largely fictional, but based on Welsh traditions. Arthur became the once and future king. the hero who would return when Britain needed him most. That legend spread across Europe. It became one of the most famous stories in Western literature, but it started in Wales, among the refugees, among the people who remembered what had been lost and refused to forget. The Welsh kingdoms survived for centuries. Gwynedd lasted until 1283, that when Edward I of England finally conquered it. Over 800 years of continuous British rule in northwest Wales. Cornwall held on until the 9th century before being absorbed by Wessex. Strathclyde in southern Scotland lasted until the 11th century. These weren't just remnants. They were functioning kingdoms, Christian, Brittonic-speaking, maintaining their identity in a world that had moved on. And they remembered. They remembered that this island had been theirs, that their ancestors had built Stonehenge, survived the Romans, and tried to survive the Saxons. They lost England, but they kept themselves. Next, we're going to talk about the evidence, the science, the DNA, the archaeology, the linguistics, the proof that all of this actually happened. So how do we know any of this? The written sources, Gildas, Bede, now the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, were all written centuries after the events, by people with agendas. They're valuable, but they're not enough. The real proof comes from the ground, from graves, from bones, from DNA. In 2022, scientists published a study in the journal Nature. They extracted DNA from over 460 medieval individuals buried across northwestern Europe, including Britain. What they found confirmed what historians had suspected but couldn't prove. Large-scale migration, population replacement, mixing. In eastern England, 76% of the ancestry came from continental North Europe, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark. That's not cultural influence. That's demographic transformation. But here's the twist. Modern English people derive only about 38% of their ancestry from Anglo-Saxons. The rest is British. What happened? Mixing. Now over generations. The Saxon population was huge in the 5th and 6th centuries, but over time, intermarriage blended the populations. By the medieval period, the genetic distinction had blurred. At Buckland Cemetery near Dover, researchers reconstructed a family tree across 4 generations, showing exactly when migrants and locals intermarried. This is unprecedented. We can see the moment intermarriage started. First generation, separate. Second generation, mixing begins. Third and fourth, fully integrated. And one high-status woman with mixed ancestry was buried with silvered jewelry, amber beads, and a whole cow. Her community valued her. The linguistic evidence is just as clear. English is a Germanic language. Its grammar, its core vocabulary, its structure, all Germanic. It's related to German, Dutch, Frisian. And Welsh is a Celtic language, related to Irish, Scots Gaelic, Breton. If the Britons and Saxons had integrated peacefully, English would have Celtic influences in its grammar. It doesn't. English has a few borrowed Celtic words, crag, tor, place names like Thames and Avon. But the language itself is Germanic. That's not integration. That's replacement, linguistic replacement. The archaeological evidence shows the timeline. Saxon burials appear in eastern England starting in the mid-5th century. By the early 6th century, they're everywhere. After the Battle of Mountbatten, Saxon expansion stopped. There are no Saxon burials in certain regions from the late 5th to late 6th centuries. The Britons pushed them back, but by 550 AD, Saxon burials resume. And this time, they don't stop. By 600 AD, Saxon material culture dominates. The transformation is complete, so that's how we know. DNA, linguistics, archaeology, written sources, all pointing to the same story. 2 peoples, 1 island, a collision that lasted 200 years. And at the end, something new. The English. Next, the close. What does all of this mean? And why does it matter now? So here's what happened. Britain in 400 AD, Celtic-speaking, Christian, Roman in memory. 3.6 million people, most of them British. Britain in 600 AD, Eastern and Southern England, now speak Old English. Germanic culture, dominant. Saxon kingdoms rising. The Britons pushed to Wales, Cornwall, the north. In 200 years, an entire linguistic and cultural identity was replaced. Not through genocide, not through one massive invasion, through migration, through mixing, through the slow, grinding logic of demographics and economics and power. The Britons who stayed adapted. Their children spoke Saxon. Their grandchildren forgot they were ever anything else. The Britons who fled to Wales kept the memory alive. And they're still there. Welsh is still spoken. The language survives. But in England, the transformation was complete. This is how England was actually born, not from a treaty, not from a royal marriage, not from a single conquest, from the collision of two peoples who fought, mixed, and became something neither side intended. The cruelty and the kindness, the violence and the love, the wars and the weddings, all of it happening at once. And from that chaos, England emerged. Right now, the world is arguing about immigration, about borders, about identity, about what it means when people move and cultures collide. This story doesn't give you easy answers. It doesn't say immigration is good or bad. It doesn't say resistance is noble or futile. It doesn't say mixing is beautiful or tragic. It just shows you what happened. And what happened was complicated. The Britons didn't vanish. They adapted, fled, or fought. The Saxons didn't just conquer. They mixed, married, and built something new. And the result, England, the English language, the English people, is the product of that collision. You are the product of that collision. If you're English, if you speak English, if you trace your ancestry to Britain, your DNA is mixed, your language is Germanic with Celtic place names and Latin borrowings. Your culture is a blend of peoples who thought they were enemies and became one people over generations. That's not theory. That's evidence. Nations aren't pure. They never have been. They're collisions. Messy, brutal, beautiful collisions of peoples who didn't choose each other but ended up building something together anyway. England is proof. So the next time someone tells you that immigration destroys nations or that immigration builds nations, remember this. It does both. And neither. Because the reality is messier than any slogan. People move, cultures collide. And what emerges is something no one predicted and no one can control. That's how England was born. That's how every nation was born. And that's the story almost nobody tells. Because it's complicated, because it challenges what we think we know, and because the evidence, the DNA, the language, the buried bodies, reveals a truth about identity that makes people uncomfortable. But it's the truth. And now you know it.